Hello and welcome to the Story Atelier, where we bring you tales full of emotion, drama, and unexpected twists, inviting you to uncover the deeper meanings hidden within each story. Today, we're diving into a powerful and heartwarming narrative that's as tragic as it is miraculous. A story of love, memory, and a journey to rediscover the pieces of a life once thought lost. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to come face to face with the love of your youth, the one you believed was gone forever? Today's story, Billionaire recognizes waitress his youthful love, presumed dead 23 years ago, will take you on that very journey. Get ready for a tale of unexpected reunions, buried truths, and the resilience of the human heart. Let's uncover together what happens when fate gives two people a second chance at the love they thought was lost forever. Now, let's dive in. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue across Greenfield Park, illuminating the sprawling lawns and casting long shadows over the winding paths. The air carried the sound of children's laughter, distant dog barks, and murmured conversations from couples enjoying the fading warmth of the day. Among the park's many visitors, one man stood out like a misplaced piece of a puzzle. Jonathan Reeves, the 42-year-old CEO of a global tech conglomerate, rarely found himself in settings like this. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he seemed out of place among the casually clad joggers, families, and sunbathers. His polished leather shoes clicked against the concrete path as he strolled without direction. His mind preoccupied, Jonathan's life was a relentless whirl of meetings, corporate strategies, and endless decisions. Yet, despite the accolades and unimaginable wealth, he often felt an inexplicable emptiness, a hollow ache he couldn't seem to fill. Today, craving a rare moment of solitude, he had left his phone behind and ventured to the park. It was a decision he seldom made, but something about the stillness of this day called to him. As he walked, his gaze wandered until it landed on a young boy darting across the grass. The child, no older than 8, chased after a shimmering trail of bubbles left by a street performer. His laughter was infectious, ringing out like a bell that cut through the ambient noise. Jonathan's lips curved into an uncharacteristic smile. For a fleeting moment, the weight he carried seemed to lighten. Nearby, a woman sat on a wooden bench with a book open on her lap. She appeared to be the boy's mother. Her dark, wavy hair framed a face marked by a quiet elegance, and her posture exuded calm, though she seemed absorbed in her reading. Her eyes flicked up occasionally, monitoring her son with a tender vigilance. Jonathan's smile faltered. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't immediately place it. "Hey, mister," the boy's voice startled Jonathan out of his thoughts. Looking down, he saw the child standing before him, his bright eyes filled with curiosity and energy. "Yes?" Jonathan asked, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse," the boy exclaimed with the kind of blunt honesty only children possess. Jonathan blinked, taken aback. "She does?" he asked, his voice betraying his confusion. "Are you sure it's me?" The boy nodded vigorously. "Yup, it's you. I saw it the other day. It's kinda old, but it's definitely you." A wave of unease washed over Jonathan. He straightened and glanced toward the boy's mother. She was watching now, her book forgotten on the bench. When their eyes met, her expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a mixture of shock and hesitation. Jonathan's breath caught. Recognition dawned like a thunderclap. "Clara?" he whispered. The woman rose slowly, her movements deliberate. There was no mistaking it now. It was Clara Daniels. The years had softened her features, but the quiet strength in her eyes was unmistakable. Memories long buried surfaced with startling clarity, tugging at Jonathan's chest. "Hello, Jonathan," she said, her voice as steady as it was uncertain. They stood there, frozen in the weight of unspoken words. the boy's curious gaze darting between them. You two know each other? The boy asked, breaking the silence. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, Charlie, Jonathan and I. We knew each other a long time ago. The boy's face lit up. Cool. Does that mean you're friends? Jonathan chuckled softly, though the sound carried a note of sadness. Something like that, he said, his eyes never leaving Clara's. The moment stretched, heavy with unresolved emotions and questions. Clara's grip tightened on her purse, as if the small bag contained the answers to the unasked questions hovering between them. Would you like to sit? Clara finally offered, gesturing toward the bench. Her voice was calm, but Jonathan could sense the tension beneath it. Yes, I think I would, he replied. Charlie, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation, resumed playing with his dog, Max, leaving the adults to their awkward reunion. As they sat, the distance between them felt both physical and metaphorical. Jonathan studied Clara, searching for the right words. What could he possibly say after all these years? He had never expected to see her again, let alone in circumstances like this. You've done well for yourself, Clara began, breaking the silence. Her voice held no malice, only a guarded curiosity. Jonathan nodded. I suppose I have, but you've built something far more meaningful. His gaze shifted to Charlie, who was now attempting to teach Max a new trick. He's your son? Clara hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Charlie is my son. Jonathan's chest tightened. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. The boy's bright eyes and infectious energy mirrored his own at that age. A question formed on his lips, but he hesitated to ask. Why do you have a photo of me? He finally asked, his voice low. Charlie mentioned it earlier. Clara's expression hardened for a moment before softening into something that looked like regret. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. Her fingers trembled as she handed it to him. Jonathan's breath caught as he looked at the image. It was from over a decade ago, taken during their last summer together before he left for college. They stood arm in arm, grinning at the camera, young and carefree. I didn't think you'd still have this, he murmured, his fingers brushing the edges of the worn photograph. Clara's voice was barely audible. I found it years later. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Jonathan's mind raced. Why had she kept it? What did it mean? And most importantly, why hadn't she told him about Charlie? Clara, he began, but his voice faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again. Why didn't you tell me? Her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. I thought I was protecting you, she said softly. You had your whole life ahead of you. I didn't want to hold you back. Jonathan shook his head, frustration and sorrow swirling within him. You didn't give me the chance to decide for myself. Clara's voice broke. I was scared, Jonathan. I was young, alone, and trying to figure out how to raise a child. I thought it was better this way. They sat in silence, the weight of her confession settling between them. Jonathan stared at the photo, his emotions a tangled mess. He had spent years chasing success, blind to what he had left behind. And now, the life he never knew he had was sitting a few feet away, tossing a stick for his dog. I need time to process this, Jonathan said finally, his voice tight. But I want to be part of Charlie's life. He deserves to know the truth. Clara's gaze softened, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. Okay, she whispered, but not all at once. Let's take this slowly. Jonathan nodded. Slowly, he agreed, though his heart ached with the weight of the years they had already lost. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an orange glow over the park, Jonathan watched Charlie play, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. This chance encounter had shattered the carefully constructed walls of his life. forcing him to confront the choices he had made and the consequences he could no longer ignore. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Reeves felt something stir within him, a sense of hope. Fragile but undeniable. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. The echo of Clara's words played on a loop in his mind. I thought I was protecting you. I thought it was better this way. Her confession had left him reeling, and every glance at the photograph now sitting on his desk only deepened his turmoil. He had spent years building his empire, driven by ambition and the relentless pursuit of success. But as he stared at the image of his younger self and Clara, their smiles frozen in time, Jonathan realized just how much he had left behind. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he had a son he never knew existed, or the years of moments he had missed with him. The next morning, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't let another day pass without taking a step forward. After wrapping up a quick meeting with his executive team, he cleared his afternoon and headed back to Greenfield Park. This time, he wore casual clothes, an attempt to blend into a world that felt increasingly foreign to him. When he arrived, he spotted Clara and Charlie almost immediately. They were sitting at the same bench, Charlie eagerly feeding bits of bread to the ducks while Clara watched him with a soft smile. For a moment, Jonathan hesitated. What if showing up unannounced was a mistake? But he shook off the doubt and approached them. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady but quiet. Clara looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Jonathan," she said, her tone unreadable. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon." Charlie turned and beamed. "Hi, Mr. Jonathan. Did you come to see Max do more tricks?" Jonathan chuckled, his tension easing slightly. "I wouldn't miss it," he said, crouching down to ruffle the dog's fur. But his attention quickly shifted back to Clara. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Charlie, why don't you take Max to the grass over there? I'll be right here." "Okay, Mom," Charlie said, grabbing the leash and bounding off with his dog. Once they were alone, Jonathan took a seat beside Clara, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday," he began. "There's so much I don't understand. Clara, I need to know everything." Clara sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I don't know where to start." "Start with why," Jonathan urged. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep Charlie a secret for all these years?" She was silent for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone, Jonathan. You had just started college, and your career was beginning to take off. I didn't want to disrupt your life, and I was scared. I didn't know how you'd react." Jonathan frowned, his chest tightening. "So you decided for me?" "Clara, I could have been there. I could have supported you, both of you." Clara looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing. You were so focused, so determined to succeed. I didn't want to be the reason you gave up on your dreams." "But Clara," Jonathan said, his voice softening, "you were my dream. You and whatever life we could have built together. Did you really think I wouldn't have chosen you?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, a tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "Maybe I was selfish," she admitted. "Maybe I was trying to protect myself, too. I was afraid of being rejected, of hearing you say you didn't want this." Jonathan leaned back, his emotions a storm he struggled to contain. He couldn't deny the pain her choices had caused him, but he also couldn't ignore the courage it must have taken for her to raise Charlie on her own. "What about now?" he asked after a long pause. "Do you still think I don't belong in his life?" Clara shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Charlie deserves to know his father, and I owe it to both of you to make this right." Jonathan nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan began to spend more time with Charlie. At first, their interactions were cautious, simple activities like tossing a ball at the park or sharing ice cream cones. But as the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. Charlie's enthusiasm was infectious, and Jonathan found himself looking forward to their time together more than anything else. Clara, however, remained guarded, though she allowed Jonathan into their lives. She kept her emotional distance. Jonathan understood why, but it didn't make it any easier. He wanted to rebuild their connection, to prove to her that he wasn't the same man who had left all those years ago. One evening, after Charlie had gone to bed, Jonathan stayed behind to talk to Clara. They sat on her small porch, the cool night air wrapping around them like a fragile truce. Clara, Jonathan began, I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your future. Both of you. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Jonathan, it's not that simple. There's so much history between us, so much hurt. I know, he said earnestly, and I'm not asking for everything all at once. I just want a chance to show you that I'm here for the long haul. Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. It's not just about us anymore. It's about Charlie. I need to be sure that you're not going to walk away again. I won't, Jonathan said firmly. I promise you, Clara, I'm here to stay. For the first time, Clara's guard seemed to lower. If only slightly. She gave him a small, tentative smile. Let's take it one step at a time, she said. Jonathan nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't everything he hoped for, but it was a start. As Jonathan drove home that night, he thought about how much his life had changed in such a short time. He had spent years chasing success, believing it would bring him happiness. But now, he realized that true fulfillment came from the connections he had long neglected. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he was on the path to something real, something meaningful, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The following weeks were filled with a mixture of progress and tension as Jonathan found himself integrating more into Charlie's life. Every moment with his son felt like a revelation, each smile, laugh, and question peeling back a layer of the life he had missed. But as Jonathan grew closer to Charlie, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Clara wasn't telling him. One crisp afternoon, Jonathan arrived at Clara's house to pick Charlie up for their planned trip to a local science museum. Charlie greeted him with the boundless enthusiasm that had quickly become the highlight of Jonathan's day. Dad, guess what? I found a cool rocket book at school, Charlie exclaimed, holding up a brightly colored children's book as Jonathan crouched down to examine it. Looks like we've got a future astronaut here, Jonathan said with a grin. Ruffling Charlie's hair, the boy beamed, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But when Jonathan glanced at Clara, standing in the doorway with a tentative smile, he saw the same guarded expression she often wore when their conversations strayed too close to the past. You two have fun, Clara said softly, her tone polite but distant. We will, Jonathan replied, his eyes lingering on her. He wanted to ask her more, to dive deeper into the unresolved tension between them. But now wasn't the time. Later that evening, after a day filled with Charlie's endless questions about rockets and planets, Jonathan returned the boy to Clara's house. As Charlie bounded upstairs, his arms full of souvenirs from the museum gift shop, Jonathan lingered in the living room. Clara, he began, his voice hesitant but firm. I need to ask you something. She turned to him, her posture stiffening slightly. What is it? There's something you're not telling me, he said, his gaze steady. I can feel it. This isn't just about Charlie or us. What are you hiding? Clara froze, her expression flickering between surprise and defensiveness. "Jonathan, I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he pressed. "I've seen it in the way you look at me. There's more to this story, isn't there?" Her silence was answer enough. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy tension. Clara avoided Jonathan's questions, brushing him off with excuses or abrupt subject changes. But Jonathan couldn't let it go. Something about her reluctance gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't move forward without the truth. His suspicions deepened one evening when he came across an old newspaper clipping tucked into one of Charlie's school project folders. The headline read, "Local Teacher Honored for Heroic Act." The article detailed how Clara had once shielded her students from a dangerous altercation during her early years as a teacher. It was a story that painted her as brave and selfless. But the small mention of her temporary disappearance after the incident caught Jonathan's attention. Why would Clara disappear after such a heroic act? He wondered. Driven by curiosity and a growing sense of unease, Jonathan decided to confront her directly. The next time they met, he didn't waste any time. "Clara, I found something," he said, holding up the clipping. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Her eyes widened, and she reached for the paper, her hands trembling. "Where did you get this?" "Charlie had it in one of his school folders," Jonathan said. "What happened? Clara, why did you disappear after this?" Clara's face turned pale, and for a moment, Jonathan thought she might deny everything. But then she sighed, sinking onto the couch as if the weight of the years had finally caught up to her. "I didn't want you to know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want anyone to know." Jonathan sat beside her, his concern growing. "Know what, Clara? Whatever it is, you can tell me." She hesitated, her fingers twisting together as she searched for the courage to speak. The incident, it wasn't just a random altercation. It was connected to someone I knew. Someone dangerous. Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Dangerous? Who?" She swallowed hard, her voice shaking as she continued. "His name was Victor Kane. He was a man I was involved with for a brief time before you. He was charming, but I didn't realize how dangerous he was until it was too late." Jonathan's heart sank. The name meant nothing to him, but the fear in Clara's eyes told him everything he needed to know. "What happened?" he asked gently. Clara took a deep breath. "When I ended things with him, he didn't take it well. He started following me, making threats. The incident at the school was his doing. He came to confront me. And when things escalated, he tried to hurt one of my students. I had to stop him." Jonathan's fists clenched. "And after that, he was arrested," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "But I knew he had connections. I disappeared for a while to protect myself and Charlie." Jonathan's stomach twisted. "Charlie? He knew about Charlie?" Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's why I never told you. I was terrified he'd find out about you, about us, and use it against me." "Against you?" Jonathan sat back, his mind racing. The pieces of Clara's story fell into place, and the full weight of what she had endured hit him like a freight train. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I didn't want to drag you into it," she said. "You didn't deserve to live with that kind of fear." Jonathan took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Clara, you don't have to carry this alone anymore. Whatever it takes, I'll protect you and Charlie. I promise." For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to believe him. But as she leaned into his embrace, she couldn't shake the nagging fear that Victor Kane, or someone connected to him, might one day resurface. And neither could Jonathan. The revelation of Clara's past added a new layer of complexity to their already fragile dynamic. As Jonathan continued to forge a relationship with Charlie, He also found himself stepping into a protector's role for both of them. But the shadow of Victor Kane loomed large, a reminder that some dangers are never truly gone. Jonathan vowed to uncover the full truth about Clara's past and ensure her safety. But as he delved deeper, he began to realize that the danger wasn't just in the past, it might be closer than either of them dared to imagine. Jonathan couldn't shake the unease that gripped him since Clara had shared the truth about her past. Victor Kane's name lingered in his mind like a dark shadow, and the thought of someone so dangerous having once been close to Clara sent a chill down his spine. He knew he had to act, not just for Clara's sake but for Charlie's safety as well. That morning, Jonathan made a call to an old friend, Detective Mark Hayes. Mark had been a close confidant during their college years and had since become a seasoned investigator. If anyone could help uncover the lingering threat of Victor Kane, it was Mark. "Jonathan, it's been a while," Mark greeted, his voice warm but professional. "What's on your mind?" Jonathan hesitated before replying, knowing the enormity of what he was about to ask. "Mark, I need your help. It's personal, and potentially dangerous." There was a pause on the other end. "I'm listening." Jonathan explained everything. Clara, the incident at the school, and the fear that Victor Kane or someone connected to him might still pose a threat. Mark listened without interruption, his tone turning serious as the story unfolded. "I'll dig into it," Mark said finally, "but you need to be careful. Jonathan, if this guy is as connected as Clara says, poking around could stir up trouble." "I don't care," Jonathan replied firmly. "I just want to make sure Clara and Charlie are safe." Meanwhile, Clara noticed a subtle change in Jonathan. He was more protective, more attentive, and while she appreciated his support, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. The fear she had lived with for so long was resurfacing, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face it again. One evening, as they sat on Clara's porch watching Charlie play with Max in the yard, she finally voiced her concern. "Jonathan," she began, her tone cautious, "what are you planning?" He looked at her, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I'm not planning anything reckless. If that's what you're worried about. I just need to be sure that Kane, or anyone connected to him, can't hurt you or Charlie." Clara sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I've spent years trying to forget about him. I don't want this to disrupt Charlie's life." "It won't," Jonathan assured her, "but ignoring it won't make it go away. We need to be prepared." Before Clara could respond, Charlie came bounding up the steps, his face lit up with excitement. "Mom, Dad," Max found a stick. "And it's huge. You've got to see this." Jonathan and Clara exchanged a small smile, the tension easing for a moment as they followed Charlie to the yard. But even as they laughed at the sight of Max proudly dragging a branch twice his size, the undercurrent of unease remained. A few days later, Mark called with an update. The news wasn't good. "Jonathan, I found something," Mark said, his voice low. "Victor Kane was released from prison 2 months ago. No one knows where he is. But there have been whispers that he's looking for someone, probably Clara." Jonathan's grip tightened on the phone. And no one thought to warn her. His release wasn't exactly publicized, Mark explained, and without proof that he's made any moves toward her, there's not much the authorities can do. "But Jonathan, if he's looking for her, you need to take this seriously." "I already am," Jonathan replied. "Thanks, Mark. Let me know if you find anything else." As he ended the call, Jonathan's mind raced. He needed a plan, a way to protect Clara and Charlie while also staying one step ahead of Kane. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at Clara's house earlier than usual, his face etched with worry. Clara noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down the coffee mug she'd been holding. "We need to talk," Jonathan said, his tone serious. Mark found something. Kane's out of prison. Clara froze, her face draining of color. What? How long? 2 months. Jonathan said, there's no confirmation that he's looking for you, but Mark thinks it's likely. Clara sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I thought this was over. I thought we were finally safe. Jonathan knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. We are going to be safe. I promise you, but we need to be cautious. We can't take any chances. Clara nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. What do we do? I've already hired security to keep an eye on the house and follow Charlie to school. Jonathan said, and I've asked Mark to keep digging. If Kane tries anything, we'll know. Clara looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. Thank you, Jonathan. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out. He said firmly, I'm here, for you and for Charlie. Despite the precautions, the days that followed were tense. Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every unexpected sound set her on edge. Even Charlie seemed to pick up on the unease, asking his mom why she seemed so worried. Then, one evening, Clara's fears were realized. It was just after sunset when a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the yard. Clara saw him through the kitchen window and froze, her heart pounding. The man was tall, his face obscured by the dim light, but there was no mistaking the menacing presence. Jonathan, Clara called, her voice trembling. Jonathan was at her side in an instant. What is it? She pointed toward the window. There's someone out there. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Stay here, he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the door. Be careful, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Jonathan stepped outside, the cool night air sharp against his skin. He scanned the yard, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Who's there? He called, his voice steady. The figure didn't move. Jonathan took a step closer, his heart pounding. I said, who's there? Finally, the man stepped into the light. It wasn't Victor Kane, but the look in his eyes was just as dangerous. You're Jonathan Reeves, right? The man said, his voice low and gravelly. Consider this a warning. Stay out of Kane's way, or you'll regret it. Before Jonathan could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the night. When Jonathan returned to the house, Clara was waiting, her face pale with fear. What happened? It wasn't Kane, Jonathan said, his voice grim, but it was someone working for him. They know we're onto them. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. What do we do now? Jonathan's eyes hardened with resolve. We fight back. For the first time, Clara saw a side of Jonathan she hadn't seen before. Fearless, determined, and ready to do whatever it took to protect the people he loved. But as they braced themselves for what was to come, neither of them could predict just how far Kane would go to reclaim his hold over Clara's life. The tension in the house was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. Clara couldn't sleep, every creak of the floorboards and rustle outside the windows setting her nerves on edge. Jonathan, however, remained a steady presence, constantly strategizing, his mind churning with ways to stay one step ahead of Victor Kane and his unknown associates. The following morning, Jonathan met with Detective Mark Hayes in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Mark arrived in plain clothes, his eyes scanning the room as he slid into the booth across from Jonathan. We've traced the guy who showed up at Clara's house, Mark said, cutting straight to the point. His name's Rick Harlow, small-time thug, works odd jobs for bigger players like Kane. If he's involved, Kane's definitely planning something. Jonathan leaned forward, his jaw clenched. What kind of something? Mark sighed. Hard to say. Kane's been quiet since he got out. But if he's sending people to deliver messages, he's building up to something. You need to be ready. I am, Jonathan said firmly. But what about Clara and Charlie? I need to know they're safe. I'll increase patrols near Clara's house and keep my team on Harlow's trail," Mark assured him. "But Jonathan, be careful. People like Kane don't play fair." Jonathan nodded, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. He wasn't just protecting Clara and Charlie, he was stepping into a world of danger he barely understood. Later that day, Jonathan returned to Clara's house, where she was waiting anxiously. She had taken the day off work to stay home with Charlie, who was playing with Max in the backyard. When Jonathan walked in, she immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. "What did Mark say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan hesitated, not wanting to alarm her. "He's tracking the guy who showed up last night. He thinks Kane is planning something, but we don't know what yet." Clara's face paled, and she sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Jonathan, what if this never ends? What if Kane never stops?" Jonathan knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "It will end," he said with conviction. "I won't let him hurt you or Charlie. We'll get through this." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, drawing strength from Jonathan's resolve. That night, the storm they had been dreading finally broke. It started with the sound of glass shattering. Jonathan was the first to react, bolting out of bed and grabbing the baseball bat he had stashed in the corner of the room. He rushed to the living room, where a brick lay amid shards of broken glass, a crudely written note tied around it. "Stay out of this, Reeves, or else." Jonathan's blood ran cold. Before he could process the threat, Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jonathan handed her the note. "It's Kane's way of sending a message." Clara read the words, her hands shaking. "He's trying to scare us. And it won't work," Jonathan said, his voice hard. "But this changes everything. We can't stay here. It's not safe." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Charlie's room was. "Where would we go?" "To my place," Jonathan said immediately. "It's more secure, and I've already hired private security to patrol the area. You and Charlie will be safer there." Clara nodded, her fear overriding any hesitation. "Okay, let's go." Within an hour, they had packed their essentials and were on the road to Jonathan's home. His estate was a stark contrast to Clara's modest house, a sprawling property surrounded by tall fences and security cameras. As they pulled into the driveway, Clara couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and unease. "This is a lot," she said as they stepped inside. "It's just a house," Jonathan replied, his focus already on ensuring everything was secure. "What matters is that you're safe here." Charlie, still half asleep, clung to Clara's hand as they settled into one of the guest rooms. Jonathan stayed up late into the night, coordinating with Mark and his security team to tighten their defenses. He knew Kane wouldn't back down easily, and he needed to be ready. The next day, Mark called with a breakthrough. "Jonathan, we've located Kane," he said. "He's holed up in a warehouse on the outskirts of town. We're moving in tonight." Jonathan's heart raced. "I want to be there." "Absolutely not," Mark said firmly. "This isn't your fight. It is my fight," Jonathan argued. "This is about protecting my family." Mark sighed. "Fine, but you stay back and let us handle it." "Understood?" "Understood," Jonathan lead. That evening, Jonathan left Clara and Charlie under the watchful eyes of his security team and drove to the warehouse. When he arrived, the area was already swarming with unmarked police cars. He parked a safe distance away and watched as Mark and his team prepared to move in. The raid was swift and precise. Officers stormed the building, their shouts echoing in the night. Jonathan stayed in his car, his heart pounding as he waited for news. Minutes felt like hours until Mark finally emerged, his face grim but triumphant. "We got him," Mark said as Jonathan approached. Kane's in custody. Relief washed over Jonathan. But it was short-lived. Is it over? He asked. For now, Mark said. But Kane's the kind of guy who has connections. Even behind bars, he could still cause trouble. You need to stay vigilant. Jonathan nodded, knowing Mark was right. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. When Jonathan returned home, Clara was waiting for him in the living room. She stood as he walked in, her eyes searching his face. Well? She asked. It's over, Jonathan said, pulling her into a hug. Kane's been arrested. Clara let out a shaky breath, her relief palpable. Thank you, Jonathan, for everything. Jonathan held her close, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. You don't have to thank me. I'd do it all over again for you and Charlie. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Jonathan realized something he hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Clara and Charlie weren't just a part of his life, they were his life. And he would do whatever it took to protect them. In the days that followed, life began to return to normal. Clara and Charlie stayed at Jonathan's estate for a while longer, slowly rebuilding their sense of safety. And as the weeks turned into months, the bonds between them grew stronger. The shadow of Victor Kane had loomed large over their lives. But together, they had faced it head-on and emerged stronger. For Jonathan, the experience was a stark reminder of what truly mattered: love, family, and the courage to fight for both. And for Clara, it was a chance to let go of the fear that had defined so much of her life. With Jonathan by her side, she finally felt free to look toward the future, a future filled with hope, healing, and the promise of second chances.